October 24th, 1944, the Philippine Sea. On the flag bridge of the Iowa-class battleship USS New Jersey, BB-62, Admiral William F. Halsey commands the most formidable naval armada ever assembled, Task Force 38. It consists of fleet carriers, fast battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, all shielded by early warning radar and fed by a massive, decrypted signals intelligence network. Halsey's primary objective is clear. He must protect the massive American amphibious invasion currently unloading troops and supplies onto the beaches of Leyte Gulf. But over the next few hours, working inside a combat information center that possesses total maritime domain awareness, one of America's most celebrated naval commanders will willingly order his ships to abandon that very objective. He will leave the primary invasion corridor completely defenseless. To understand how the most technologically advanced fleet on the planet was lured out of position, subscribe to continue uncovering declassified archives with us. This is not just a story of a tactical misstep. This is an anatomical look at a command psychology failure, a breakdown in intelligence interpretation, and the limits of raw technological superiority when human bias takes the helm. The core historical paradox driving the Battle of Leyte Gulf is how a commander, backed by overwhelming numerical and intelligence advantages, willfully chased a mathematically inferior threat. In late October 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy initiated Operation Shogo. This was a complex, multi-pronged naval counterattack designed to disrupt the American liberation of the Philippines. The operation relied on 3 separate naval groups converging on Leyte Gulf simultaneously. The most immediate threat to the American landing forces was the Center Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. This was a heavy surface fleet built around massive dreadnoughts, including the super battleship Yamato, armed with 18.1-inch naval rifles, capable of firing 3,200-pound armor-piercing shells over 40 kilometers. Halsey was not blind to this threat. In fact, he had advance warning. American Signals Intelligence, or SIGINT, had intercepted disjointed Japanese radio traffic indicating a major surface movement. On October 23rd, 2 American submarines, the USS Darter and the USS Dace, intercepted the center force in the Palawan Passage. Utilizing their periscopes and primitive surface search radars to track the Japanese columns, the submarines fired spreads of 21-inch Mark 14 torpedoes. They successfully sank 2 heavy cruisers and severely damaged a third. Kurita's flagship was lost, forcing him into a chaotic transfer of his flag and command staff to the Yamato. The American submarines transmitted detailed contact reports back to the Pacific Fleet. Halsey knew the center force was advancing. The next day, October 24th, Halsey launched massive aerial strikes against Kurita's ships as they transited the narrow waters of the Sibuyan Sea. The Combat Information Center on the USS New Jersey was a marvel of 1940s engineering. Cathode ray tubes glowed with radar returns, while radio men rapidly transcribed Morse code intercepts from Pearl Harbor's Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, known as FRUPAC. Utilizing this data, Halsey directed waves of Grumman, TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, and Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers to hammer the Japanese vessels. The TBF Avengers carried 2,000-pound Mark 13 aerial torpedoes, while the SB-2C Helldivers delivered 1,000-pound armor-piercing bombs directly onto the armored decks of the Japanese fleet. They sank the super battleship Musashi after hitting it with an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. American aviators returned to their flight decks, reporting immense destruction. The combat reports flowing into Halsey's staff painted a picture of a shattered Japanese fleet in full retreat. Here is where the official story falls apart, and the reality of human cognitive bias takes over. Halsey was aggressively minded. His doctrine was built on offensive action, and his ultimate prize was the Japanese aircraft carrier fleet. For the first 2 days of the engagement, Halsey was frustrated. The Japanese carriers were missing. Intelligence intercepts had confirmed the presence of a carrier force, but American scout planes had not visually located them. Then, late in the afternoon of October 24th, American reconnaissance finally spotted Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's northern force. Carriers. This was exactly what Halsey had been waiting for. What Halsey did not know, and what his intelligence staff failed to properly synthesize, was that Ozawa's carriers were essentially empty. They were a carefully constructed decoy, intentionally transmitting heavy radio traffic to act as a siren song for the American admiral. Operation Shogo was a desperation strategy. Ozawa knew his air groups lacked veteran pilots, many of whom had been lost in previous engagements in the Philippine Sea. American naval intelligence had actually identified this severe lack of qualified aviators months prior. They knew Ozawa's flight decks posed minimal offensive threat. But this granular assessment was either buried in the daily intelligence summaries or intentionally ignored by Halsey's staff. The Japanese High Command had correctly deduced that Halsey's aggressive nature would compel him to chase the prestigious carriers, leaving the door open for Kurita's heavy battleships to slip into Leyte Gulf. Stay with me here, because the technological disconnect in this moment is staggering. Halsey had a massive intelligence apparatus at his disposal. His fast battleships and carriers possessed SK air search radar systems capable of tracking aircraft at distances up to 160 kilometers. He had high-frequency direction-finding equipment, known as HFDF, constantly listening to enemy transmissions. Yet Halsey and his staff began to selectively filter the information flowing into the flag bridge. They prioritized the visual reconnaissance reports of the newly discovered Japanese flat tops over contradictory acoustic and radio direction finding data. Despite the heavy damage Kurita's center force sustained in the Sibuyan Sea, American night reconnaissance aircraft operating radar systems reported that the Japanese battleships had turned around once again. They were no longer retreating. They were heading east, directly toward the San Bernardino Strait. This narrow waterway was the back door to Leyte Gulf. If Kurita made it through, he would have a clear, deep-water path right to the vulnerable amphibious transport ships and the troops on the beaches. Halsey received these updated tracking reports, but he convinced himself that Kurita's fleet was too badly damaged to remain a combat-effective threat. He assessed the center force as neutralized, assuming they lacked the cohesion, speed, and firepower to mount a coordinated surface attack. Think about what that decision actually meant. Halsey was commanding 65 ships in Task Force 38, including 8 fleet carriers, 6 light carriers, and 6 fast battleships. He had enough naval firepower to easily divide his forces without losing tactical superiority. He could have left his fast battleships, heavily armored and equipped with their own 16-inch naval guns, to guard the San Bernardino Strait, while taking his carrier strike groups north to hunt Ozawa. The operational plans drawn up earlier in the day had even formalized the creation of this surface action group, designated as Task Force 34, exactly for this contingency. The communications staff had gone so far as to draft a preliminary battle plan detailing the formation of Task Force 34. Instead, Halsey ordered his entire formidable Third Fleet to steam north. Every single fleet carrier, every single fast battleship, every single heavy cruiser, he left absolutely nothing behind to guard the San Bernardino Strait. No radar pickets, no destroyer patrols. He assumed the United States 7th Fleet, under Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, which was operating further south inside Leyte Gulf, covering the Surigao Strait, was watching the Northern Passage. Kinkaid, conversely, intercepted Halsey's radio broadcasts and read the preliminary battle plan regarding Task Force 34. Kinkaid logically assumed Halsey had left those heavy battleships behind to lock down the northern approach. This ambiguity in the chain of command, combined with Halsey's singular fixation on the Japanese decoy carriers, created a catastrophic operational gap. As the sun set on October 24th, the immense armada of the Third Fleet powered up their steam turbines and vanished over the northern horizon, chasing a phantom threat of empty flight decks. The SK radar screens covering the San Bernardino Strait went completely blank, and advancing quietly under the cover of darkness, completely unseen and entirely unhindered, Admiral Kurita's heavily armored dreadnoughts prepared to slip through the unguarded maritime choke point. The trap had worked flawlessly. To understand the true anatomy of this command failure, we have to look at the precise mechanics of the Japanese deception. The Imperial Japanese Navy did not simply sail empty ships into the Philippine Sea and hope for the best. Operation Shogo 1 was a masterpiece of electronic warfare and psychological manipulation engineered by the combined fleet under Admiral Soemu Toyoda. By late 1944, Japan faced a severe logistical crisis. Their fleet was physically divided. The remaining aircraft carriers were anchored in the home islands to protect the mainland, while the heavy battleships were stationed thousands of kilometers away at Linga Anchorage near Singapore, sitting as close as possible to the remaining fuel reserves in the Dutch East Indies. Synchronizing a massive counterattack from these two disconnected locations without modern, encrypted satellite communications was an extreme operational hurdle. It required strict timing, absolute radio silence from the main attack force, and a decoy element capable of generating enough electronic noise to mask the true threat. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's Northern Force was designed from the keel up to be that noise. Look at what the declassified records show about the specific hardware makeup of Ozawa's Phantom Fleet. The centerpiece was the heavy fleet carrier Zuikaku. This vessel carried immense psychological weight for American commanders. It was the last surviving carrier from the 1941 strike on Pearl Harbor. Trailing the Zuikaku were three light carriers, the Zuiho, the Chitos, and the Chiyoda. But the most deceptive elements of the fleet were two converted Isa-class hybrid battleship carriers, the Isa and the Hyuga. These hybrid vessels were a direct engineering response to previous heavy Japanese aviation losses. Naval architects had removed the massive 14-inch rear gun turrets from these battleships and replaced them with concrete flight decks, elevators, and catapult systems. But during Operation Shogo 1, neither the Ise nor the Hyuga carried a single aircraft. They were strictly visual deception platforms, engineered to trick high-altitude American reconnaissance aircraft into reporting a larger number of flat tops. The aviation capability of the rest of the Northern Force was equally hollow. Ozawa sortied with approximately 110 operational aircraft across 4 carriers. Furthermore, the Japanese naval aviation training pipeline was completely exhausted. Due to critical shortages in high-octane aviation fuel, training flights had been severely curtailed for months. The pilots on Ozawa's decks were raw recruits. Launching a heavily armed aircraft requires raw engine power and a catapult. But landing a plane onto a pitching wooden deck in the middle of the ocean requires hundreds of hours of spatial awareness training. These aviators did not have it. Their operational orders were to launch a single, one-way strike against the American forces and then land at terrestrial airfields in the Philippines. They were never intended to return to their ships. But a fleet without aircraft cannot draw the attention of the largest American armada ever assembled simply by sailing into open water. They had to be heard. Stay with me here because this is where the signals deception tradecraft comes into play. A standard carrier strike group maintains strict emission control, known in naval terminology as EMCON. They maintain complete radio silence to avoid detection until their first wave of aircraft is airborne. Ozawa's radio men were explicitly ordered to do the exact opposite. They deliberately broke EMCON. They broadcasted continuously on standard Imperial Japanese Navy frequencies, utilizing the 75-meter band. They transmitted endless streams of weather reports, logistical requests, and dummy strike coordination messages. Furthermore, they utilized legacy cryptographic codes that the Japanese High Command strongly suspected the Americans had already compromised. Ozawa was actively feeding the American High Frequency Direction Finding Network, or HFDF. The United States Navy maintained a massive ring of listening stations across the Pacific, triangulating enemy positions based on radio wave propagation. Ozawa's radio men leveraged this network to paint a massive, glowing electronic target on their own backs. And American naval intelligence saw right through it. Back at Pearl Harbor, thousands of miles away from the combat zone, the Joint Intelligence Center, Pacific Ocean Areas, known as JICPOA, was processing this exact radio traffic. Analysts had spent months meticulously charting the collapse of Japanese naval aviation. They analyzed the transmission patterns from the Northern Force and immediately noted the severe anomalies. The volume of traffic was too high. The cryptography was too accessible. Intelligence summaries drafted in the weeks prior to the battle explicitly stated that the Japanese carrier forces were hollow shells, suffering from a fatal deficit of trained aviators. So how did this highly accurate intelligence fail to stop the Third Fleet from taking the bait? The answer lies in the intense information overload inside an active combat information center and the dangerous allure of confirmation bias. On the flag bridge of the USS New Jersey, the staff was processing thousands of data points every hour. While signals intelligence suggested the Japanese carriers were weak, American tactical doctrine prioritized visual confirmation above all else when high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft finally broke through the cloud cover and visually identified the flight deck of the Zuikaku, along with the concrete decks of the Issei and Hyuga. The tactical brain of the Third Fleet snapped entirely to that single data point. The visual confirmation of the enemy carriers overrode the complex, nuanced signals intelligence indicating the decks were empty. The Third Fleet command staff wanted to fight a decisive carrier battle, and the Japanese handed them the exact visual evidence they needed to justify it. While the Third Fleet powered up its steam turbines and turned its heavy combatants north, a chilling realization began to dawn back at Pacific Fleet headquarters. Deep inside the underground bunker at Makalapa Crater in Hawaii, Admiral Chester Nimitz and his senior intelligence staff were monitoring the master plotting tables. Junior officers continuously updated the massive map of the Philippine Sea, placing red wooden pins for Japanese surface groups and blue pins for American task forces. An intelligence officer looking down at that board would see a fatal geometry taking shape. The blue pins, representing the immense firepower of Task Force 38, were moving rapidly to the north, pulling away at over 25 knots. Meanwhile, the red pins, representing the heavy dreadnoughts of the Japanese center force, were moving steadily eastward, advancing through the Sibuyan Sea under strict radio silence. The plotting officers at Pearl Harbor understood the time-distance equations of naval warfare. Massive steel warships require immense time to transit. Even at a flank speed of 30 knots, a fast battleship requires hours to cover 100 nautical miles. As the officers updated the master plotting board, they realized that the American fleet was opening an operational gap that could not be easily closed. By taking all of the fast battleships north, the Third Fleet had left the San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. Worse still, Pacific Fleet Headquarters was monitoring the radio traffic of the United States Seventh Fleet operating further south inside Leyte Gulf. The Seventh Fleet was primarily composed of slow, unarmored escort carriers, transport vessels, and amphibious assault craft. They were actively providing close air support for the ground troops on the beaches. The intercepted communications made it abundantly clear that the Seventh Fleet commanders believed the northern choke point was safely guarded by heavy American battleships. No one was watching the door. As the sun began to rise on the morning of October the 25th, the time for strategic adjustments simply ran out. The heavily armored vanguard of the Imperial Japanese Navy was no longer a theoretical threat on a plotting board. They had successfully navigated the narrow straits in complete darkness, entirely undetected by American radar. Now, steaming into the open waters off the coast of Samar, they were about to encounter a small, lightly armed American escort force that had absolutely no idea the most powerful surface fleet in the world was bearing down on them. At 0 hours on October 25th, the heavy warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy's center force entered the San Bernardino Strait. This narrow maritime corridor separates the Philippine islands of Luzon and Samar. It is a treacherous stretch of water, characterized by blind corners, hidden shoals, and strong tidal currents that can easily push a massive steel hull off course. Navigating this choke point at night, under strict emission control and without the aid of active surface search radar, required exceptional maritime skill. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded 4 fast battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers through this darkness. Leading the vanguard was the Yamato, the heaviest and most heavily armed battleship ever constructed. If Admiral William Halsey had left even a single Fletcher-class destroyer behind as a radar picket, Kurita's advance would have been detected instantly. American surface search radar would have illuminated the tight Japanese formation miles before they exited the strait. The heavy 16-inch naval rifles of the American fast battleships would have possessed a mathematically perfect firing solution against a target that had no room to maneuver. But the radar screens covering the strait did not exist, because the ships carrying them were steaming hundreds of kilometers to the north. Kurita's fleet navigated the dangerous currents completely unhindered. They cleared the eastern exit of the San Bernardino Strait and entered the open waters of the Philippine Sea. They turned south, hugging the coastline of Samar, heading directly toward the primary amphibious landing zones at Leyte Gulf. Just after dawn, the morning mist began to clear off the eastern coast of Samar. Operating in these waters was the northernmost unit of the United States Seventh Fleet's Escort Carrier Group, designated as Task Unit 77.4.3, universally known by its radio call sign, Taffy 3. Commanded by Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, Taffy 3 was not designed for heavy surface combat. Look at the engineering reality here. The core of Taffy 3 consisted of 6 Casablanca-class escort carriers, often referred to by their hull classification as CVE. These were essentially modified merchant ship hulls. They possessed absolutely no heavy armor belting. Their Uniflow steam engines could generate a maximum speed of just 18 knots. For defense, each carrier relied on a single, manually operated 5-inch gun mounted on the stern. Escorting these slow, vulnerable carriers were 3 Fletcher-class destroyers and 4 smaller John C. Butler-class destroyer escorts. Their primary mission was anti-submarine patrol and providing close air support for the infantry on the beaches using Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and Eastern Aircraft FM-2 Wildcat fighters. At 6:45 in the morning, an American pilot flying a routine anti-submarine patrol in a TBF Avenger spotted unexpected acoustic anomalies and surface wakes through the broken cloud cover. Dropping below the cloud deck, he visually identified the unmistakable pagoda-style superstructure of Japanese battleships. When the contact report reached the flag bridge of the escort carrier USS Fanshawe Bay, CVE-70, Admiral Sprague initially dismissed it. He assumed the pilot had misidentified the heavy lattice mass of Halsey's Task Force 34. Sprague operated under the absolute belief that American fast battleships were locking down the northern approach. Minutes later, the horizon to the north began to flash with heavy optical rangefinders and anti-aircraft searchlights. Massive columns of water erupted around the slow American escort carriers, dyed in brilliant shades of red, green, and pink. The Japanese used colored dye in their massive armor-piercing shells to help individual battleships track their specific fall of shot. This was not Task Force 34. Kurita's center force was less than 30 kilometers away, and they were closing the distance at 25 knots. Taffy 3 was caught in an extreme close-quarters battle with a near-zero probability of survival. Sprague immediately ordered his entire task unit to turn south, launching all available aircraft into the wind while desperately running toward the cover of a localized rain squall. But an 18-knot merchant hull cannot outrun a 27-knot heavy cruiser. Knowing his carriers would be overtaken within the hour, Sprague ordered his tiny destroyers and destroyer escorts to initiate a rearguard action. Think about the sheer scale of that hardware disparity. The USS Johnston, DD 557, was an unarmored Fletcher-class destroyer commanded by Commander Ernest Evans. It displaced just 2,100 tons. Evans turned his ship completely around and charged alone at flank speed directly into a fleet of heavy dreadnoughts. The Johnston utilized its Mark 37 fire control system to unleash rapid-fire barrages from its 5-inch main guns, specifically targeting the bridges and optical rangefinders of the heavy Japanese cruisers. To utilize its primary anti-ship weapon, the Johnston had to close the distance to within 9 kilometers to launch its Mark 15 torpedoes. Pushing through walls of heavy incoming fire, the American destroyers utilized their funnel smoke systems and chemical smoke generators on the fantail to lay a dense, white chemical curtain across the surface of the ocean. This optical interference temporarily blinded the Japanese optical rangefinders, forcing the heavy cruisers to alter their firing solutions and physically turn away from the torpedo spreads, buying precious minutes for the fleeing escort carriers. But as the battle raged, a bizarre engineering paradox began to save American lives. Kurita's fleet had loaded their primary naval rifles for a decisive engagement against Halsey's heavy battleships. The Yamato was firing Type 91 armor-piercing shells, each weighing 3,200 pounds. These projectiles were heavily machined, utilizing a delayed action fuse designed to punch through up to 16 inches of face-hardened steel armor before detonating deep inside an enemy citadel. The American escort carriers and destroyers had hull plating less than 1 inch thick. They were so lightly constructed that they offered absolutely no physical resistance to the massive Japanese munitions. As a result, hundreds of Type 91 armor-piercing shells passed cleanly through the unarmored bulkheads of the American ships, plunging into the ocean on the other side without ever arming their internal fuses. While the kinetic impact punched clean holes straight through the superstructures, the lack of high explosive detonation meant the American vessels remained structurally sound far longer than Japanese engineers could have ever anticipated. In the skies above, the pilots of Taffy 3 initiated continuous, relentless attacks against the Japanese dreadnoughts. Because they had been equipped for ground support and anti-submarine duty, the TBF Avengers and FM-2 Wildcats carried entirely the wrong munitions for a heavy surface engagement. Aviators dropped anti-personnel fragmentation bombs onto the armored decks of heavy cruisers. They utilized depth charges set to detonate on physical impact rather than hydrostatic pressure. When they exhausted all their ammunition, American pilots executed dry runs, diving directly into heavy anti-aircraft fire with empty pylons to draw the attention of Japanese gunners away from the heavily damaged surface ships below. Throughout this chaotic engagement, frantic calls for heavy naval support flooded the primary command airwaves. Admiral Sprague transmitted unencrypted, plain text messages directly to the 7th Fleet Command, stating his task unit was under intense fire from major enemy fleet units. Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, commanding the 7th Fleet, received these transmissions and realized the entire northern flank of the Leyte invasion had collapsed. He immediately began broadcasting urgent messages up the chain of command, routing them via radio relays to Halsey's 3rd Fleet, which was operating hundreds of kilometers to the north. Halsey received these emergency dispatches on the flag bridge of the USS New Jersey. He held in his hands confirmed reports that the Japanese center force, the very fleet he had assumed was neutralized, had breached the San Bernardino Strait and was actively dismantling Taffy 3. Yet Halsey did not immediately turn his fast battleships around. The command psychology in this specific moment reveals a catastrophic cognitive lock. Halsey was firmly committed to destroying Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's carrier force. He read the fragmented, desperate radio transmissions from the 7th Fleet, but his staff interpreted them through the lens of their own operational bias. They assumed the reports of heavy battleships were either misidentified heavy cruisers or an exaggerated local skirmish. Furthermore, Halsey believed Kincaid had sufficient heavy combatants of his own, specifically a group of older American battleships positioned to the south in the Surigao Strait, which could be mobilized to assist Taffy 3. He fundamentally failed to recognize that those older battleships were critically low on armor-piercing ammunition after their own night engagement and were too slow to intercept Kurita's fast-moving force in time. As Halsey stubbornly continued his pursuit of the decoy carriers, Taffy 3 began to suffer extreme losses. The structural integrity of multiple American vessels succumbed to the overwhelming volume of Japanese fire. Escort carriers and destroyers were slowly neutralized, slipping beneath the waves of the Philippine Sea. The frantic rearguard action was buying time, but the physical endurance of the small American ships was rapidly running out. The fragmented emergency signals did not just reach Halsey. They were intercepted, logged, and plotted on the massive strategic boards thousands of miles away. Down in the underground bunker at Pearl Harbor, the Pacific Fleet Command Staff watched in near disbelief as the situation unspooled. The strategic isolation of Taffy 3 was no longer a localized tactical problem. It threatened the total elimination of the Philippine invasion beachhead. The commander of the Pacific Fleet could not stand by while the Third Fleet chased shadows. Admiral Chester Nimitz approached his communications officers, preparing to break standard operational protocol and intervene directly in an active tactical engagement, setting in motion a cryptographic sequence that would shatter the rigid discipline of the United States Navy. Deep beneath the volcanic rock of Makalapa Crater in Hawaii, the strategic reality of the Philippine Sea was entirely clear. Inside the underground command bunker of the United States Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz and his senior intelligence officers stood over the master plotting boards. They were processing the frantic, unencrypted radio transmissions from the Seventh Fleet, which was currently enduring heavy losses off the coast of Samar. Nimitz was an intensely analytical, quiet commander who built his doctrine on strict operational discipline. He was watching a complete structural failure of that discipline unfold in real time. The United States Navy possessed a fatal administrative flaw at this exact moment in the war. The chain of command was bifurcated. The amphibious forces and the Seventh Fleet answered directly to General Douglas MacArthur, who commanded the Southwest Pacific area. However, the heavy strike assets of the Third Fleet answered to Admiral Nimitz, who commanded the Pacific Ocean areas. Because of this divided command tree, Halsey and the commander of the Seventh Fleet, Vice Admiral Thomas Kincaid, were not technically in the same chain of command. They could communicate via radio relays, but they did not directly answer to one another. Nimitz was the only operational commander who possessed the authority to look at the entire board, step across the administrative boundaries, and order the Third Fleet to pivot. Nimitz approached his communications staff. He needed to find out exactly where the heavy American armor was positioned. He dictated a terse, highly specific operational query intended for Admiral Halsey. He simply wanted to know the physical location of the fast battleships. The message was brief. Where is Task Force 34? To understand how this simple request triggered one of the most severe psychological breakdowns in American naval history, we have to examine the precise engineering mechanics of wartime cryptographic tradecraft. In 1944, long-range naval communication relied entirely on high-frequency, continuous wave radio transmissions. These signals were broadcast across the open ocean, meaning anyone with a tuned receiver could intercept them. To secure these vital operational orders, the United States Navy utilized an incredibly complex piece of hardware known as the ECM Mark II cipher machine, heavily classified under the Joint Military Designation SIGABA. Unlike standard rotor machines utilized by rival militaries, the SIGABA utilized 15 internal cryptographic rotors that stepped in highly irregular, electrically driven patterns. With every single keystroke, the electrical pathways inside the machine changed, generating a completely randomized ciphertext. It was a mathematical fortress, so robust that no opposing intelligence agency ever successfully broke its core encryption during the conflicts. But even a flawless cryptographic machine possesses human vulnerabilities. Japanese cryptanalysts were actively scanning American radio traffic, searching for what intelligence officers call cribs. A crib is a predictable piece of plain text, such as standard military headers, routine weather formats, or formal sign-offs. If an enemy codebreaker can guess the first or last few words of an encrypted message, they can use that known text to reverse engineer the rotor settings of the cipher machine. To completely eliminate this vulnerability, the Navy instituted rigid padding protocols. Communications ensigns were strictly ordered to add unrelated, nonsensical phrases to the very beginning and the very end of every operational message. These dummy words would be encrypted along with the main text, entirely masking the true beginning and end of the transmission from listening enemy analysts. To ensure the receiving American radio men knew exactly which words to strip away before handing the message to a commander, the padding phrases were always separated from the actual operational text by double consonants, almost universally utilizing the letters RR. Look at the exact sequence of events that occurred next in the Makalapa Crater communications room. A young ensign took Nimitz's brief query and prepared to format it for the SIGABA machine. He needed a random phrase for the front padding and a random phrase for the rear padding. At the front of the message, he typed the phrase, "Turkey trots to water." He then added the double R separator. He typed Nimitz's actual message, "Where is RPT? Where is Task Force 34? He added another double R separator. For the rear padding phrase, the ensign reached for another random string of words. Perhaps influenced by the fact that October 25th was the anniversary of the famous Charge of the Light Brigade, he typed out a phrase reminiscent of the corresponding Alfred Tennyson poem, "The World Wonders." The cipher tape was fed into the SIGABA machine, encrypted into a wall of scrambled letters, and broadcast across the Pacific. Thousands of kilometers away, the radio antennas on the flag bridge of the USS New Jersey, BB-62, pulled the high-frequency signal out of the air. Down in the secure cipher room, radio men fed the scrambled text into their own SIGABA machine, perfectly configured with the daily rotor settings. The machine clattered, printing out the decrypted plain text onto a paper tape. A communications officer on Halsey's staff tore the tape from the machine and began formatting it for the Admiral. The rules of naval cryptography dictated that he must physically strip the padding phrases away. The officer looked at the front padding. "Turkey trots to water." This was obvious, nonsensical gibberish. He correctly identified the double R separator and discarded the front phrase. Then he looked at the rear of the message. He saw the double R separator, followed by the words, "The World Wonders." Stay with me here, because this is the moment where rigid engineering protocols collided with human interpretation. To the communications officer, "The World Wonders" did not sound entirely like random nonsense. Given the active tactical crisis, the frantic unencrypted calls for help from the 7th Fleet, and the massive operational gap left at the San Bernardino Strait, the phrase sounded entirely plausible as an intentional, dramatic emphasis added by the Pacific Fleet Command Staff. The officer actually debated the phrase with a colleague in the cipher room. Operating under extreme pressure, they made a fatal interpretive error. They decided the phrase was genuine. They left it attached to the end of the message. A junior officer ran up the ladders to the flag bridge and handed the slip of paper to Admiral Halsey. Halsey read the text exactly as it had been formatted. "Where is, repeat, where is Task Force? 34, the World Wonders." The command psychology in this specific moment reveals a catastrophic breakdown. Halsey was a four-star admiral, fiercely aggressive, heavily sleep-deprived, and operating under immense operational stress. His entire doctrine was built on the projection of overwhelming offensive force and personal pride. When he read that piece of paper, he did not see a simple operational query from a commander trying to locate his fast battleships. He perceived the message as a severe, sarcastic, public rebuke from Admiral Nimitz himself. Because the message had been broadcast to multiple stations, Halsey believed Nimitz was actively mocking him, questioning his courage and his tactical competence in front of the entire Pacific Command network, including General MacArthur and Vice Admiral Kincaid. The technological superiority of the Third Fleet, the massive radar arrays, the heavy armor of the fast battleships, all of it was instantly paralyzed by a wounded human ego. Witness accounts from the flag bridge of the USS New Jersey detail a complete loss of composure. Halsey reportedly turned pale. He ripped his specialized command cap from his head and threw it violently onto the steel deck. He began shouting in a blind rage, pacing the bridge, reportedly driven to tears of frustration and perceived humiliation. The commander of the most powerful naval force on the planet was trapped in a psychological spiral. The situation deteriorated to the point that Rear Admiral Robert Carney, Halsey's chief of staff, had to physically intervene. Carney stepped forward, reportedly grabbing Halsey by the arm, and firmly told him to stop, demanding that he pull himself together and command his ships. But the damage was already done. The critical commodity in naval warfare is time, and time was violently bleeding away. While the small, unarmored escort carriers and destroyers of Taffy 3 were actively being dismantled by heavy, armor-piercing shells off the coast of Samar, the commander of the Third Fleet was frozen. He did not immediately issue the order to turn his fast battleships south. He continued to brood over the message. Every single minute that Halsey stood paralyzed on the flag bridge of the New Jersey, his heavy combatants were steaming further to the north at 25 knots. They were actively burning fuel and increasing the geographic distance between their 16-inch naval rifles and the desperate rearguard action occurring inside the invasion corridor. Halsey was firmly committed to destroying the decoy carrier force, stubbornly clinging to the belief that his initial tactical assessment had been correct. As the operational window to intercept the Japanese center force rapidly began to close, the entire American naval staff waited to see if the admiral would finally break off his northern pursuit, or if blind pride would allow the Philippine amphibious invasion to face total tactical elimination. It was 10:55 in the morning before Admiral William Halsey finally broke his psychological paralysis. Nearly an hour and a half had passed since the decrypted dispatch from Admiral Chester Nimitz arrived on the flag bridge of the USS New Jersey, BB-62. During those 90 minutes, the entire Third Fleet had steamed almost 40 kilometers further to the north, actively pulling away from the strategic collapse occurring off the coast of Samar. When Halsey finally issued the command to formally detach Task Force 34 and send his heavy combatants racing back to the south, the operational window to execute a decisive interception had already slammed shut. Turning a massive surface fleet around is not a simple tactical maneuver. It requires immense kinetic energy and highly complex logistical choreography. The fast battleships, including the USS Iowa, BB-61, and the USS Washington, BB-56, had been running their immense steam turbines at flank speed for hours. Their bunker fuel reserves were dropping, but the real logistical crisis rested with the screening vessels. Fletcher-class destroyers possessed severe hull speed limitations, meaning that operating continuously at 25 to 30 knots, burns through their internal fuel stores at an unsustainable rate. To send this heavy surface action group racing back toward the San Bernardino Strait, the escorting destroyers had to top off their fuel tanks directly from the heavier battleships. Executing at-sea refueling requires ships to steam parallel to one another at reduced speeds while tethered by heavy rubber hoses. Conducting this operation in the middle of a heavy ocean swell delayed the heavy surface action group by over 2.5 hours. By the time the vanguard of Task Force 34 was fully fueled, detached from the carrier groups, and steaming south at 28 knots, they were hundreds of kilometers away from the Leyte Gulf invasion beaches. While Halsey's heavy armor was trapped in a desperate high-speed transit, the situation off the coast of Samar was reaching a highly unusual climax. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, commanding the Japanese center force, possessed the heaviest naval guns in the world. He had successfully breached the primary defensive line and was literally within striking distance of the vulnerable amphibious transport ships unloading troops onto the beaches. But Kurita was entirely overwhelmed by an extreme fog of war. Post-war interrogations conducted by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey revealed exactly what was happening on the command bridge of the super battleship Yamato. Kurita genuinely believed he was fighting the primary American heavy fleet. The frantic, uncoordinated aggression of the small American destroyers, coupled with the relentless, swarming attacks from the escort carrier aviators, created a massive optical illusion. Japanese optical rangefinders were highly complex pieces of precision glass, but they were completely disrupted by the dense chemical smokescreens deployed by the American surface ships. When Kurita's lookouts spotted the small Casablanca-class escort carriers running for the horizon through breaks in the smoke, they misidentified them as full-sized American fleet carriers. Kurita's staff calculated the speed of the retreating American vessels at nearly 30 knots, when in reality the unarmored merchant-style hulls were struggling to maintain 18 knots. Think about what that decision actually meant. Kurita voluntarily walked away from the very objective Operation Shogo 1 was engineered to eliminate. But the retreat of the center force also cemented the reality of Halsey's tactical blunder. Naval engineers and historians have extensively modeled the tactical geometry of the San Bernardino Strait to understand what would have happened if Halsey had maintained his defensive posture. If the commander of the Third Fleet had formalized Task Force 34 earlier that morning and left them to guard the exit of the strait, the outcome would have been mathematically precise. A defensive force of 6 fast battleships, waiting in the darkness just outside the strait, would have executed a classic naval maneuver known as crossing the T. As the heavy Japanese dreadnoughts emerged single file from the narrow navigational channel, they would have been forced to steer straight ahead, entirely unable to bring their massive rear batteries to bear on targets off their beam. Look at the hardware disparity in that specific theoretical engagement. The American fast battleships were equipped with advanced Mark 38 gunfire control systems. These directors were physically integrated with centimetric surface search radar systems, which utilized highly focused electromagnetic pulses to calculate target range and bearing regardless of visibility. The American heavy cruisers and battleships could generate perfect firing solutions in total darkness. The Japanese dreadnoughts, relying entirely on visual optics and star shells to illuminate their targets, would have been completely blind. The entire center force would have faced total tactical elimination from concentrated, radar-guided 16-inch naval gunfire before they ever reached the open waters of the Philippine Sea. Instead, Halsey's delayed pursuit south became known derisively among American naval aviators as the Battle of Bull's Run, a mocking reference to the Admiral's famous nickname. When the vanguard of the American fast battleships finally arrived at the entrance to the San Bernardino Strait, it was past midnight. The heavy Japanese dreadnoughts were gone. They had successfully slipped back into the Sibuyan Sea. All that remained for Halsey's massive guns to engage was a single, straggling Japanese destroyer, the Nowaki, which was rapidly neutralized by an overwhelming volume of surface fire. The grand surface engagement that Halsey had spent his entire career preparing for simply vanished into the dark. The declassified communication logs and subsequent military inquiries heavily dissected the operational collapse at Leyte Gulf. The core finding was that the near disaster was born from an administrative fracture. The United States Navy operated with an entirely ambiguous chain of command between the Third Fleet, answering to Admiral Chester Nimitz in Hawaii, and the Seventh Fleet, answering to General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific area. There was no single theater commander present on the water to synchronize the defense. Halsey assumed Vice Admiral Thomas Kinkaid was guarding the southern flank and keeping localized watch on the northern door. Kinkaid assumed Halsey's fast battleships were permanently holding the choke point. Neither commander explicitly confirmed the other's operational status until the shooting had already started. In the years following the conclusion of the war, the actions of the Third Fleet commander remained intensely controversial. Military historians and naval strategists still fiercely debate the legacy of that day. One faction argues that Halsey's singular fixation on the decoy carriers constituted a massive dereliction of duty. By abandoning his primary mandate to protect the amphibious beachhead without notifying the Seventh Fleet, he left thousands of troops and lightly armed sailors exposed to the heaviest naval guns on the planet. They point to the heavy losses sustained by the unarmored escort carriers and destroyers as a direct consequence of his command psychology, arguing the decision bordered on a court-martial offense. The opposing faction counters that Halsey was operating entirely within the boundaries of his aggressively mandated operational doctrine. He was navigating an extreme fog of war, heavily manipulated by brilliant Japanese electronic deception tradecraft. They argue that naval intelligence failed to properly brief him on the hollow state of the Japanese carrier aviation pipeline, and that his instinct to permanently eliminate enemy flight decks was a mathematically sound strategy based on previous engagements where carrier air power proved absolute. Despite the cascading series of intelligence failures, cryptographic misinterpretations, and command paralysis, the sheer industrial weight and technological superiority of the American war machine absorbed the blow. The Imperial Japanese Navy expended the very last of their mobile surface power executing a masterclass in electronic deception, only to falter at the absolute finish line due to their own localized confusion. The events at Leyte Gulf forced a fundamental restructuring of American naval command architecture, permanently ending the era of divided fleet responsibilities and cementing the requirement for unified combatant commands. The massive steel dreadnoughts that slipped through the darkness that night would never again sail as a coordinated offensive fleet, leaving behind a legacy defined not just by the weapons they carried, but by the extreme consequences of human bias at the highest levels of command.